and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, the U.S. is blaming Russia for an airstrike on the UN aid convoy in Syria. The strike came during a ceasefire sponsored by the two powers. But as they now trade bitter accusations, what hope is there of the ceasefire lasting? And UK Prime Minister Theresa May wants more grammar schools across the nation. Critics say this would only increase inequality in the British education system. If the UK returns to selective schooling, what impact could it have on education systems elsewhere? Russia and the United States clashed at the United Nations on Wednesday over the aid convoy attack in Syria and airstrikes on Syrian government forces. Both sides accuse each other of breaking the delicate truce in the bitter war. The International Syrian Support Group is set to discuss a new solution to the crisis. But can there be new solutions?
Just a week after a ceasefire was reached in war-torn Syria, diplomatic efforts have again turned into a war of words. The UN Security Council met for tense crisis talks Wednesday as Russia and the US continued to accuse each other of carrying out deadly attacks in Syria.
This attack has dealt a very heavy blow to our efforts to bring peace to Syria, and it raises a profound doubt about whether Russia and the Assad regime can or will live up to the obligations that they agreed to in Geneva.
The United States believes 2 Russian aircraft attacked an aid convoy near Aleppo on Monday, destroying 18 trucks in a 31-vehicle convoy. Russia denied involvement and called for restraint.
So I think we need to refrain from emotional reactions and not make comments immediately, public comments, but first investigate and be very professional.
Meanwhile, the US was accused of carrying out a series of airstrikes in the eastern city of Deir al-Zor that left dozens of Syrian government soldiers dead. The Syrian government said more than 80 soldiers were killed and called the attack deliberate.
This hostile act from the U.S. is a very serious attack against Syria and its army, and it's crystal clear evidence of the support by the United States and their allies to the Daesh organization and other terrorist armed groups.
The U.S. denied the accusation and claimed the airstrikes were targeting Islamic State forces. Diplomatic efforts are still ongoing despite the acrimony between the U.S. and Russia. The two countries will chair a meeting Thursday bringing together world powers. They aim to renew efforts pushing for a ceasefire and eventually a political resolution to the bloody 5-year-old conflict.
We'll see if that's going to happen. For more on Syria tensions, we're now joined in our Beijing studio Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. And in Moscow, we are joined by Mr. Dmitry Barbich, political journalist and commentator at the Sputnik International. In Austin, Texas, in the U.S., we are having Mr. Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and also CEO of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. Do we have any result? The two gentlemen coming from Russia and the United States when it comes to who is responsible for the attack of that humanitarian convoy. Mr. Barbich, from the Russian perspective.
Well, it is not yet clear what happened to that convoy, because even if you look at the footage on television, when you have an airstrike, there are usually craters around the destroyed trucks. You don't see any craters on the footage that we have seen on television so far. So it's a mystery what exactly happened on Monday, why 18 trucks of humanitarian aid were destroyed. What we know for sure is that the United States mistakenly hit at least 62 Syrian government soldiers and did not even apologize for that. I mean, you heard the speech of Samantha Power at the UN Security Council. She didn't say excuse us, she didn't say forgive us. She said it was not our intention. So can you imagine what would happen if someone killed 62 US soldiers on American soil? What would be the consequences if that party did not apologize for what happened?
Well, my question is more about the humanitarian convoy. Ambassador Volker, we understand the United Nations has already changed its earlier statement accusing Russia of doing the attack. What does Washington make of this change from the United Nations? Is Washington, or rather American forces, the drone, as the Russian earlier indicated, appear minutes before the attack, responsible?
Yeah, I honestly have not seen any evidence that indicates exactly who was responsible and how. We know the convoy was blown up. It is a terrible tragedy because of what's happening with the siege of Aleppo and the people there. It is the government forces, supported by Russia, that are conducting that siege. I don't know specifically what happened with the aid convoy, and as your guest said, I think we should avoid inflammatory statements where we don't have the facts in front of us. The only forces that are flying air strikes in Syria are the United States and Russia and the Syrian government. This is one where, unfortunately, the U.S. did kill these Syrian soldiers. The U.S. was not involved in the strike against the convoy here, so it was probably one of the other two. The bigger picture is that we need a solution to this war. We need to see that the people are able to get humanitarian relief and to be in safety. And that's going to require a settlement of some kind where the Assad government basically accepts that they are not going to have control over the whole territory. They're going to have to let others live in peace.
Ambassador Volker, you know better than I do that it has to start somewhere. So where is it going to start? The reason, Mr. Cui, this humanitarian convoy attack becomes such a big news is because when the ceasefire was just announced and this attack happened, and people are wondering if humanitarian resources cannot even deliver, what could happen really on the ground? So several things I want you to shed a light on as a third party in a way, even though China is a member of the Security Council. Help us to understand this. There has been different views. First of all, U.S. accusation against Russia for the convoy attack. Russia denied it. Secondly, Russia brought out the video of a local vehicle, apparently, drawing a mortar near the humanitarian convoy before it was attacked. Did not explain exactly what the video meant or Russia was having in mind. And then we saw Russia's accusation against the U.S. of the drone possible attack against the humanitarian convoy. And then there are different other stories all coming up at the same time. We don't want you to go into all these stories, Mr. Cui, because you're not on the ground. You cannot really judge. But the question is, when we have so many conflicting versions of what exactly happened, what does that reflect?
Yes, exactly what I would like to say, a suspense drama happened recently in Syria since the ceasefire agreement signed more than 10 days ago. So what happened exactly? No matter it's accidents or incidents, no matter who did that, maybe Russia, United States, or Syria government or rebel force, no matter who did it, I think the purpose is to destroy the ceasefire agreement. So it shows a very complicated situation behind the ceasefire agreement. But of course, so far, I think there is still some hope for both United States and Russia, because so far, both two governments not yet say that okay, the ceasefire already fair.
But can Mr. Barbish from Russia, that the two governments move on from here? I mean, it seems quite already in a change of words at the United Nations, fired up Secretary of State from the U.S. vis-a-vis a foreign secretary from your country as well. So are the two countries ready to move on from this incident for real solutions?
Well, I agree with our Chinese participant that the people who destroyed that humanitarian convoy, they of course didn't want a peaceful solution in Syria. And I think you have enemies of the peace settlement on both sides of the front line in Syria. I think that we can distinctly see certain differences in the attitudes of various US officials. Just remember how peaceful and accommodating Secretary Kerry was on the 9th of September when that agreement was signed with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. They seemed to get on very well. Even after the initial news about the strike on Monday, Secretary Kerry said that the agreement is not yet dead.
Right.
But we have a very different voice from other US officials. Samantha Power immediately said that whoever hit the convoy, Russia is responsible. You remember that quote. So it looks like inside the United States you have different attitudes. There is an attitude which is for an agreement, and Kerry represents it sometimes.
Right.
But sometimes you have very belligerent voices. Excuse me, it reminds me of the situation, around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Moscow was often accused of having no coordination between the foreign ministry and the army. Unfortunately, it looks like we have a similar situation now with the United States, when, for example, Ashton Carter, the head of Pentagon, speaks a lot more belligerently than John Kerry, the head of the State Department.
Okay, even though you didn't mention, Mr. Barbish, my question, which is rather whether Moscow is willing to move ahead beyond this incident, but I have to fairly throw that question back to...
I can tell you, Moscow is ready to move beyond.
Okay, I got your words over there, even though you don't represent the foreign ministry.
Any compromises suggested from the United States would be accepted.
Okay, all right then. Ambassador Volker, see, Mr. Barbish from Russia has already shown his attitude. So what about from Washington? The division Mr. Barbish mentioned, and also ready to move on?
The U.S. has a very, very weak hand in Syria. Russia is there with airstrikes against the opposition forces. They're supporting the government. They have their own military forces on the ground, and they're playing a major role in supporting the government. And the government is attacking and surrounding Aleppo, creating this humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing. And the rebels are, of course, fighting back against the government. The U.S. effort in Syria has been very, very different. It's been focused on the Islamic State. We're trying to attack the Islamic State because of what it represents. So we have these very different agendas all playing out at the same time.
All right.
With that weak position of just doing airstrikes, nothing else, the U.S. is really not a very effective negotiator. We don't have a lot to bring to the table. And it really does rest on Russia and its support for the Assad government to actually create the conditions where there is a peace and where humanitarian aid can be delivered.
Well, Ambassador Volker, if I could mention to you some views coming from Russia, it is trying to suggest, I'll get to you, Mr. Barbish, very in a moment, but Mr. Volker, the Russian side is suggesting that the U.S. should very clearly separate the rebels from the terrorists. And it seems that it addresses also to the root issue that you are talking about. The U.S. is looking at ISIL rather than putting all of its efforts onto this civil war. So what do you make of Russia's demand on the U.S. side?
Well, I think it reflects the fact that we are looking at this through very different prisms. The U.S., as I said, is doing airstrikes against ISIS, but we need to have ground forces that are supporting the effort against ISIS as well. And so that's why we are working with some of these Syrian rebel groups. John Kerry even went so far as to say that if they violate the ceasefire against the government, we might even reconsider our support for those groups. Because our focus is to get them fighting against ISIS, not against the regime. But it's a very, very messy situation inside Syria because they are being attacked by the regime and they do seek to fight back. That's why it's also complicated.
I got your point. Mr. Barbish, please respond.
Well, I can't fully agree with Ambassador Volker that the United States has a weak hand in Syria, because if you look at the past, the United States and its coalition have been bombing the Syrian territory 12 months longer than Russia. Before the Russian planes appeared in Syria, which was September 2015, 12 months before that, the United States had been hitting targets on the Syrian territory. And indeed, the United States initially said that there were no Islamists among Mr. Assad's enemies. That was in 2011, 2012. Then the United States grudgingly accepted that there were some Islamists, that the Islamic State is bad. Ambassador repeated it today, but just recently the United States acknowledged that besides the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, which has been rebranded recently, Jabhat al-Nusra is also a dangerous terrorist organization. Right. So I think that in future the United States will recognize that a few more organizations, some of them recently considered by Americans as legitimate moderate opposition, may also be in fact extremists. I can mention Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham, two groups which the United States refused to see as terrorists. They all need to be stopped. They all need to be targeted. And Russia targets them as well as the Islamic State. Russia doesn't target the moderate opposition. Moderate opposition supporters came to Moscow for negotiations with the government of Syria.
Well, may I, among the two of you gentlemen, call a ceasefire for now, at least for this edition of our program. And before I go to a question with Mr. Cui, I'm going to come back to you two gentlemen later. Mr. Cui, what the debates between these two gentlemen earlier is a vivid illustration of the complex layers of issues within this Syrian war. You got civil war going on, you got anti-terrorism going on, you got the big powers struggles toward one another, and you also got the global governance issue now being challenged. All of this, all entangled together on this. So what do you think could be the next step, given the fact we've already got the incident, given the fact we've already got the traded words and accusation against one another, given the fact there might be divisions in every capital about how to deal with this and how to deal with the partner, quote unquote. So what do you think?
If we want to, seriously to save the ceasefire agreement, because as we know, the purpose of this ceasefire agreement is once there is a successful ceasefire, United States and Russia will work together to try to maybe open the political procedure for the Syria peaceful solution. But another question, why will not go back to the original points?
What is the original point?
Which means, of course, firstly, more investigation, and please give some more truth to the international community. And then please get some more agreement on, firstly, the stand to this Syria Assad regime. Because as we know, why at this moment there are some cooperation between Russia and the United States? Because of the pressure of fight against ISIL some months ago. So both two countries have to do something, but to some degree it's just an agreement of convenience. But now, of course, maybe there are less pressure from contact against ISIL, but because if there are more and more incidents, certainly there will be more concern and pressure for international community.
I have to say, Mr. Cui, you are pointing both sides back to the most difficult question, which is what to do with the Assad regime. Are you trying to stir in the water even more, Mr. Cui? So I have a lot of respect for the other two gentlemen, because if ceasefire can be implemented as the two had demonstrated, we are going to have real ceasefire, at least in words. But I have to invite your final opinion before we go. Ambassador Volker, next step, if we really want a solution?
Well, I think what we have to do is create a safe space inside Syria where the population of Aleppo, where refugees, where Sunni population can live. And that is something that is beyond what the United States has suggested to this point, but I believe we'll need to see some kind of ceasefire and partition inside Syria that allows for stability and relief to the population.
I see. Mr. Barbich, also 40 seconds for you.
Well, I would remind you that Syria had been living for decades a peaceful life before the so-called Arab Revolution started there, supported and probably instigated by the United States and their allies, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. I think Syrians themselves should decide their fate. They should decide if Mr. Assad should stay in power or if he should be replaced. Russia doesn't want to decide for them. It's up to the Syrians to decide what their government is going to be, how they resolve the Kurdish question and other questions. The United States also should start apologizing, at least when it kills 62 foreign soldiers.
All right. Well, we still got some accusations going on between these two gentlemen, but at least we have already figured out some clues for the politicians to work on. Dmitry Barbish from Russia, Kurt Volker from the U.S., Cui Hongjian from China. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us and shedding some light from your perspective on this very complicated issue. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight, still to come. Britain is caught up in a debate about selective schooling as Prime Minister Theresa May proposes to increase the number of grammar schools. Could the final outcome of the argument affect how other countries design their own educational systems? And now we turn to education in the UK. British Prime Minister Theresa May put herself on a collision course with her main opposition party by proposing the reintroduction of grammar schools. May unveiled measures to allow for a radical expansion of what she described as good school places in her first major domestic speech since entering number 10 on the Downing Street. With the proposed new wave of grammar schools and selection by house prize and give every child a chance to go to a good school. Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Progress or regression? British Prime Minister Theresa May announced her plan to reintroduce grammar schools in England earlier this month, triggering heated debates. Modern grammar schools are state secondary schools that select pupils by exams taken by children at age 11, known as the 11+. Tony Blair's government banned the establishment of any new grammar school in 1998. The decision was on the basis that the schools separated pupils into elite education and blue-collar trades. There are currently only about 163 grammar schools in England and 69 in Northern Ireland. There are no state grammars in Wales or Scotland. Prime Minister May defended her proposal, saying it is not a turn backwards. She said her plan aims to help ordinary working-class families. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn points out that the proposal would divide children at the age of 11, which might even lead to segregation for the few. The main factor behind the dispute is inequality in the education field. Fighting for education resources is not only a UK problem, but takes place in every corner around the world.
For more discussion on the UK education reform proposal, we're joined here in Beijing. Dr. Wang Yan, Director of the Department of International Exchange at the National Institute of Education Science. Welcome. In Hong Kong, we are joined by Dr. Li Jun, Deputy Director of the Education Policy Unit at Hong Kong University. We all know there has been certain legacies left in the educational system with some of the British tradition inside Hong Kong. But let me begin by asking you, Ms. Wang here in Beijing, what do you make of this debate going on in the UK, observing from China?
Well, actually, as far as I know, this is still an ongoing debate, and if this will really happen in the future is still a question mark. And but I understand the goodwill behind this policy and assumption. Actually, that echoes the policy that was also adopted by Conservative Party in 1992, that is by offering more choices and diversities to give the children more opportunities and access to equal access to education. But on the other hand, we have to remember that the education quality is largely also associated with the socioeconomic status. And unless the socioeconomic status were changed and also were distributed more equal, and then the students' performance in whichever school they will be enrolled in might not change very much.
So if I could sum up in one sentence what you have just said, whether it is grammar school or not, if some of the basic root causes causing the gap have not been addressed, then there's no way it can be fair education. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's go to Dr. Li in Hong Kong. What do you think? Do you agree with Dr. Wang here in Beijing? She seemed to suggest a very long process But of course, educational reform has to be done all the time.
Well, good evening, Tian Wei, and also Yan. Well, I think that's a really good question. And the reintroducing of the grammar schools, I think probably we should look at a little bit more background information about that. From the very beginning, grammar schools focus on Latin studies. So, and in other words, that means that not the ordinary people can afford to go to that school. And in 1944 and later in 1947, the whole British Kingdom has endorsed the proposal for the grammar schools nationwide. And at the very beginning, people thought that could be a way to equalize educational opportunities for everybody. But later on, it gradually turned out that the grammar schools actually divide kids into, using David Cameron's word, into different shifts and goals. In other words, that's different classes. So actually, since 1960s and 70s, people argue against that the benefit of the grammar school, and they spent for new schools to be established by Tony Blair in 1998. But this time, I think the new PM intended to focus on the educational qualities. So she tried to reintroduce the system.
I see.
But I'm not so optimistic about that intention
but
to bring
Dr.
quality into.
Right. Dr. Liu, I think
Yes.
you just mentioned the key word to your overall answer, that is the quality of education, whether it's called grammar school or non-grammar school or secondary school, whatever it is. So in the proposal, is there any specific content that would make you feel the quality of education likely to be increased? Will that quality of education increasing, suggested by the proposal, address to the overall population of those in the age of education, or likely to be only selective groups? I think that are the key issues. Those are the key issues. Dr. Li.
Well, I think, well, it's always a dilemma, actually an ethical dilemma for policymakers to make a good judgment in balancing quality and equality. Well, if, let's say, if a state can provide a very, very good quality of education, but it's not accessible equally to everybody in the country. So what does that mean to the country and to the society as a whole? So that's always a dilemma for any country, actually.
Right.
And in China, if we look at into our own system, we will see we can reflect on the key school system. Actually started from 1953 in early times and stopped for 10 years during the Great Cultural Revolution. And it was reintroduced in 1978 by Deng Xiaoping, because that's the time that we really need talents to build up the country. And that's a specific time we have to take the very practical considerations for that.
Oh, Dr. Wang, it seems that Dr. Li is suggesting at different times we have different priorities. So at times, sometimes we should have the key school or grammar school. Other times, well, maybe equality is more important, so let's have something like the secondary school. Do you agree?
Well, I think in the case of UK, actually, it's not a matter of choice, but it's a result of this kind of two-party political system.
Yes.
And
But the reason why we are debating about this issue is not necessarily we want to point out what the UK should do, but rather this as an interesting case study for all educations around the world on the issue of equality vis-a-vis quality, on the issue of priorities. I think this is the key.
well, yeah, there are two kinds of policy designs or policy schemes. One is this kind of like a neighborhood enrollment policy. All the children are obliged to enroll in the school in the neighborhood. And then we have this kind of students, they can enter into the schools that they choose by their performance in the competitive examinations. Each of these two types of policies have their own pros and cons. In the later case, it will definitely drive the examination-oriented teaching or education. For example, in the UK, in a similar reform, say like two decades ago, one of the consequences is the more teaching to the test in the classrooms and in the schools. And then in the first case, when these students, they are obliged to go to the school that they might not choose if they could. And then there is also the problem that the students don't like these schools and they could not find the subjects or teachers or the courses that fit into their interests that could actually undermine their potential development.
Yeah, there's always the dilemma over there. And then, Dr. Li, if the UK, for whatever reason, whether you call it political or social, eventually adopted this school system, grammar school system, would that send any message to other educational systems around the world? Dr. Li?
Yes. Can you say that? Ask your question again, please.
Oh, my question is very simple. That if the UK did what Prime Minister May proposed, grammar school, does that send any specific message to educational systems around the world?
Well, I cannot get your point clearly, but probably I would say that in the world there is no perfect system that can take both. I mean, quality and equity. So as said, it's always a dilemma, and it's about how we measure quality and by what. In the UK system, that's 11 plus, the so-called 11 plus examination actually is based on the intelligence of students' potentials. But does that mean all about students' potentials? And in China, we use Gaokao to filter students get into universities. And that's also, we have criticized that a lot over years.
Right.
So that's also a question for us. How to define the quality, and in what sense, and for what purpose.
Okay, you still raise the questions rather than answer the question. That also once again shows the complexity of the question. So, Dr. Wang, what do you say? Does that send a message if the UK really go back to grammar school system?
Yes, I think it really makes sense and could convey some message to the world. One thing is that this kind of high-stake examination by competition to enter into the high-achieving or top-performing schools could work, because there is a lot of controversy against this kinds of high-stake examinations, like the case in China, and that could really drive the examination-oriented education. And on the other hand, this kind of system actually, according to the empirical study, has been proven to be the most fair system in the world, because only in that system students can get opportunity to enter the best school or top performing schools by their performance. So once again, this I think would convey a message that this could be a policy choice that as a kind of like pursuit for the equity.
Well, Dr. Wang, I want to continue by asking a little bit about that, because the reason many people argue against grammar school system or the so-called key school system as being used in China is because they are arguing for diversity. They're arguing for capabilities of students beyond academic scores and achievements. So that addresses us to the fundamental question of what is the purpose of education. At least what is the purpose of education during the middle school and the high school period of time. So what do you think as an educator about this ever debated fundamental question, particularly now?
Well, the purpose of education, well, you know, there is a very popular Chinese saying like that's the mission of the teachers. Very lofty mission is the engineering of the human soul. So
well, that's a slogan, but is the slogan
Okay,
really the reality?
slogan.
That's another issue, right? But Dr. Wang, don't let me interrupt your answers.
Okay,
Go
sure.
ahead.
This actually explains what education is mean, what kind of purpose education is meant to serve, and so as the educators or the schools, their responsibility is not only to impart knowledge, but also more and more we're talking about competences, the 21st century competences like interpersonal competences and interpersonal competences, etc.
Right.
And whatever schools that will be developed or built in the case of the UK, I think these schools will all face the same challenge.
Right.
They have to transform the teaching content and the way that they deliver this knowledge and skills to the students, so that students can master or grasp these kind of competences. But that could be very difficult to assess.
Well, tell me about the difficulties. I mean, every family has, relatives and friends, children who are facing exactly the dilemma that you're talking about, Dr. Wang. Let me go to you, Dr. Li. China also, we face this constant challenge of what kind of educational system we want and what kind of test system are we going to have. What does that mean for the quality of education? Just one recent example, Dr. Li, is that the middle school entrance exam is likely to be abolished from its original form, but rather with some interesting new introductions. Earlier, there were talks about and practices about students having different kinds of talents. For example, sports, culture, music, many other things can be added with extra points when having this kind of exams. And now that is likely to be abolished in the very near future. So we see these dramatic changes in educational policy and also exam entrance policy constantly, shall we say, not only in China, elsewhere as well. Every 5 years, every 10 years, and every 20 years. Should we have more consistent policies? Or actually, ever-changing policy is likely to benefit us because the circumstances have also changed? I throw you a very big question, a long question, but I think I should set the stage very well before you answer it. So go ahead, Dr. Li.
Well, actually, that's a very good question, and I got the point. That's very important for policymakers to think about. In the short run, probably we would desire a kind of more consistent policies for educational reforms. But if we look at back to the history, we will see educational reform just like swing from left to right and from right to left again and again like a pendulum. The reason is, as you actually pointed out, it's because of the changing societal context and conditions, and we have to find good ways to respond to that kind of challenges, especially in nowadays the radical globalization, commercialization of education, and the digitalization of education. All these combined together to serve kind of a very strong force. And our policymakers must address these challenges. In terms of educational missions, I would consider that's actually multiple. We cannot use a narrow-minded perspective to look at educational missions. I don't mind students to be weaponed with a lot of very practical skills and can find a job right away after graduation from universities. For example, be a very good, competent engineer or a teacher. That's of course very good. But to me, I would feel education, the fundamental mission for education is to unfold the younger generation's potentials and also humanities. That's very, very important.
Okay.
We could have a very evil-ish scientist who work on nuclear weapons to destroy human beings, the Earth. So that's, to me, I feel is even more urgent in the new era.
Dr. Wang, before we go, 30 seconds for you.
Okay.
The world is changing so fast. People are saying educational system is so much lacking behind. Are we just trying to struggle a little bit, but actually it doesn't make sense, whatever we tried or whatever new policies we are trying to adopt?
Well, I think most of the comments that were saying that education is lagging behind, well, I would say half of them are from the education field, but most of them are made by taking an outsider perspective. Because if you actually look at the process that happened in China, actually we have been going through a very intensive, quick and small-paced step of the reforms. So many things has been done, many reforms have been made, and tremendous progress has been made.
All right, well, you are very optimistic about all the changes. There are people who have different opinions. That's only true when it comes to educational debate. It's going on all the time. Thank you for now, the two of you's contribution, Dr. Wang Yan here in Beijing and Dr. Li Jun from Hong Kong. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us. Or you can also check out your YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.